My name is Walter. I am 68 years old. And 4 days ago, my own grandson looked me in the eye at his engagement dinner and told the entire table that I was an embarrassment who should have died before I got old enough to need help. I did not raise my voice. I did not put down my fork. I folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, and walked out into the parking lot while 40 guests watched in silence. Within 1 week, I had quietly unwound every dollar I had ever put behind his name, closed the business account that carried my signature as guarantor, and made sure the wedding he was so proud of would never happen the way he planned it. Before I explain exactly how a tired old man brought down a boy who thought he'd already won, tell me, neighbor, where are you watching from tonight? Type your city in the comments. And if you believe that the people who raised you should never be treated like furniture, hit that like button before we go any further. To understand why I did what I did, you have to understand the 2 years that led up to that dinner table. My son Richard died when my grandson Tyler was 19. A construction accident, the kind that takes a man in 9 seconds and leaves a family standing in a hospital hallway for the rest of their lives. Tyler's mother had already been gone for years by then, out of the picture since he was a boy, and so it fell to me, his grandfather, to raise a 19-year-old who suddenly had no parents left at all. I was 62 years old when that happened. I had already buried a wife. I had already buried a son. And instead of retiring the way I'd planned, instead of spending my savings on fishing trips and slow mornings, I sat Tyler down at my kitchen table and told him he would never have to worry about a roof over his head as long as I was breathing. I meant it the way you mean things when grief has hollowed you out and all you have left is the next generation. I paid for his last 2 years of college outright. I co-signed the loan on his first car when the dealership wouldn't touch a 20-year-old with no credit history. When he decided, at 23, that he wanted to open a specialty coffee roasting business instead of taking the safe office job I'd found for him through an old colleague, I didn't lecture him about risk. I drained $40,000 from my retirement account and became a silent partner. I told myself I was doing what any grandfather would do. I told myself Richard would have wanted this. I told myself I was building something for the boy so that when I was gone, he would never know the kind of scraping, uncertain years I'd known as a young man. For the first year, the business struggled the way every new business struggles, and Tyler called me constantly. He needed advice on suppliers. He needed help reading a lease agreement. He needed someone to sit with him in the back office at 11 at night when the numbers didn't add up and he was too proud to admit he was scared. I was there every single time. I drove 40 minutes each way without complaint. I told him the story of my own father, who'd worked a steel mill for 30 years and never once complained about the ache in his hands, and I told him that ache was the price of building something that lasted. Somewhere around the second year, the calls started coming less often. The business found its footing, started turning a real profit, and a woman named Bree came into his life. She was polished in a way that made me uneasy from the first afternoon I met her, the kind of polish that comes from practice rather than comfort. She had opinions about everything, delivered with the confidence of someone who has never once had to consider she might be wrong, and Tyler began repeating those opinions back to me like scripture. He stopped asking my advice on the business. He started correcting the way I talked about it, telling me I didn't understand modern branding, and that my old ways of thinking were something the company had moved past. I told myself this was just what happens. Young people grow. Young people pull away. I told myself that as long as he still called on Sundays, as long as he still let me watch the shop on the 2 afternoons a week he trusted me to run the register, none of the rest of it mattered. It mattered. 6 months ago, Tyler and Bree got engaged, and the coffee shop that I had bled $40,000 into became, in every conversation, entirely his. His vision, his hard work, his sacrifice. I was mentioned, when I was mentioned at all, as my grandfather, who helped out a little when I was starting. A little. I sat in my recliner the night I heard him say that on a podcast. Some local business blog had recorded, and I felt something in my chest go cold and quiet in a way it hadn't gone since the week Richard died. But I still went to every family dinner. I still showed up at the shop on my 2 afternoons, wiping down espresso machines and restocking pastry cases like a part-time employee, instead of the man whose name was still, legally, on 18% of that company. Because that's what you do. That's what I believed love looked like. You show up. You keep showing up, even when showing up costs you a piece of your own dignity every single time. Because the alternative is admitting that the person you sacrificed everything for might not actually want you there. The engagement dinner was held at a restaurant Bree's parents had chosen, an expensive steakhouse downtown with dim lighting and a wine list longer than my arm. 40 guests, most of them Bree's extended family and Tyler's new circle of friends from the business networking events he'd started attending, people I'd never met and who looked at me the way you'd look at an usher who'd wandered in from the wrong wedding. I wore my good Navy suit, the one I'd bought for Richard's funeral, because it was still the nicest thing I owned. Halfway through the second course, Bree's father raised his glass and made a toast about the self-made young entrepreneur his daughter was marrying, a man who had built an empire from nothing but grit and vision. I watched Tyler's face as he soaked in every word, watched him nod along like a man accepting a crown that had always been his. Nothing from nothing. As if I hadn't co-signed a loan that still had my name on it. As if there wasn't $40,000 of my dead wife's pension sitting in the walls of that building. I don't know what possessed me. Maybe it was grief finally cracking through 20 years of swallowed pride. Maybe it was simply hearing nothing one too many times. I raised my own glass quietly and said, gently, that I was proud of how far the shop had come since we opened it together. The table went silent the way a room goes silent right before something breaks. Tyler's face changed first, a flush crawling up from his collar. He set his glass down harder than he needed to and said, in a voice pitched just loud enough for the whole table to hear, that I needed to stop trying to take credit for his life every time I got the chance, that I was an old man who should be grateful he still let me work behind the counter at all, and that frankly, at my age, with my health the way it was, it would honestly be less complicated for everyone if I just wasn't around to make things awkward anymore. He said it with a laugh at the end, like it was a joke, the kind of joke that only works if everyone else is too embarrassed to call it what it actually was. Nobody at that table laughed. Bree looked down at her plate. Her father cleared his throat and reached for the breadbasket like it might save him from the moment. And I sat there, 68 years old, and understood with total clarity that the boy I had raised from 19, the boy I had driven 40 minutes each way for at 11 o'clock at night, had just told a room full of strangers that my death would be a convenience. I folded my napkin. I stood up slowly, the way you do when your knees have earned the right to take their time, and I said nothing. I walked past the surprised faces, past the waiter balancing a tray of drinks, out through the heavy glass doors into the parking lot, where the cold hit me like something honest for the first time all evening. I sat in my truck for a long time before I turned the key. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect the old man in this story to cry, and I didn't. What I felt instead was something closer to arithmetic, a long column of numbers finally being added up. I drove home, and I did not sleep. By 6 the next morning, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad and every piece of paper I could find relating to that business, going through drawers I hadn't opened in months. It turned out that grief has a strange gift buried inside it. It teaches you, eventually, exactly how much you are willing to lose, and exactly what you are no longer willing to give away for free. I called my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Carol Faison, who had handled Richard's estate and who had warned me, gently, 2 years earlier, that putting $40,000 into a business run entirely by a 23-year-old without ironclad paperwork was, in her words, a beautiful mistake. I had waved her off at the time. Family doesn't need paperwork, I told her. Family is the paperwork. I sat in Carol's office that morning and watched her pull my file. And within 20 minutes, she found something I had genuinely forgotten in the fog of those early grieving years. When I'd put the $40,000 in, I hadn't simply handed Tyler a check. Carol, even against my protests at the time, had insisted on structuring it as a documented capital contribution in exchange for an 18% ownership stake in the LLC, with my name listed as a silent managing member. Tyler had signed it without reading it closely, eager to get the money and open his doors. He had for 2 years been running a company in which his grandfather was not a sentimental footnote. I was, on paper, an actual legal owner with real rights. And there was more. The commercial lease on the building, the one Tyler proudly told podcast hosts he'd secured through his own hustle, had required a personal guarantor because a 23-year-old with no credit history couldn't get a landlord to take him seriously. That guarantor was me, my name, my social security number, my signature, standing behind every missed payment risk for 5 years. Carol asked me what I wanted to do. I told her I didn't want revenge for the sake of revenge. I wanted Tyler to understand in a way that could not be laughed off at a dinner table, exactly whose shoulders he had been standing on. I wanted him to feel, just once, the particular cold of realizing the ground under his feet was never entirely his own. We started with the lease. Carol drafted formal notice to the landlord withdrawing my personal guarantee, effective in 30 days, citing irreconcilable differences with my co-owner. The landlord, a pragmatic man who had never fully trusted a 25-year-old's business plan in the first place, immediately began requiring Tyler to either find a new guarantor or post a security deposit equal to 8 months' rent, money the shop did not have sitting free in its accounts. Because every spare dollar had gone into the new espresso equipment, Bree had insisted made the shop look like it belonged on Instagram. Then we moved to the ownership stake. As an 18% silent member, I had never once exercised my right to review the company's financial records. I exercised it now. Carol requested a full accounting, every transaction, every vendor payment, every payroll run for the last 24 months, exactly as the operating agreement Tyler had signed entitled me to. It took the accountant 6 days to compile it, and when it landed on Carol's desk, I finally understood something that made the parking lot outside that steakhouse feel almost gentle by comparison. Tyler had been paying himself a salary nearly double what the business could actually support, funding the difference by delaying vendor payments and, twice, by pulling directly from what should have been payroll tax withholdings, a practice that any accountant would tell you is one of the fastest ways to draw federal attention. Bree, meanwhile, had been paid as a marketing consultant for a business she had no formal role in, $4,200 a month for what Carol dryly described as an Instagram account with 1,100 followers. The wedding they were planning, the one that had inspired that steakhouse toast about grit and vision, was quietly being financed by money, bled out of a company that was already, structurally, on my shoulders. I sat across from Carol and felt that same cold arithmetic settle over me again. I could have called the police. I could have handed this file to the district attorney and watched Tyler explain payroll tax fraud to a federal investigator instead of a wedding planner. Some nights, in the 2 weeks that followed, I let myself imagine exactly that, the satisfaction of watching him marched out of that shop in handcuffs in front of the very networking friends who called him self-made. But I decided against it, the same way I imagine another old man in another kitchen once decided against the fast, easy version of justice. Prison would have let Tyler become a victim in his own story. He would have told himself, and everyone who'd listen, that his grandfather had destroyed him out of spite, out of jealousy, out of an old man's bitterness at being left behind. He would never have had to sit with the truth. And the truth was the only thing I actually wanted him to have. So instead, I exercised my rights as a silent member of that LLC to force what the operating agreement called a buyout event, triggered specifically by material misuse of company funds, exactly the clause Carol had insisted on, including 2 years earlier when I told her family didn't need paperwork. I did not ask for the business to be shut down. I asked, formally, in writing, that my 18% stake be bought out at fair market value, effective immediately, and that going forward, any capital contribution I had made would be treated strictly as what the paperwork always said it was, a loan, now due in full, with the interest that had been accruing quietly for 2 years, and that Tyler, in all his talk of being self-made, had apparently never bothered to read about. The number came out to just over $61,000, due within 90 days, or the landlord's lease default clause would kick in, and the shop, the whole shop, the counters he'd trained Bree to photograph in soft morning light, would revert to me as guarantor of record, giving me the legal right to either sell the lease or shut the doors entirely. I did not do this quietly. I had Carol send it registered, the way you send something you want a person to actually feel arrive. Tyler called me 11 times over the following 2 days. I did not answer. On the 12th call, I finally picked up and I let him talk. He was not calm. He used words I had not heard him use since he was a teenager grieving his father. Ugly words, desperate words, and underneath all of it, for the first time in 2 years, I heard something that sounded almost like the boy I'd raised instead of the man he'd become. He asked me how I could do this to family. I told him, quietly, that I had asked myself the same question the moment he told a table full of strangers it would be more convenient if I were dead. I did not shout. I want you to understand that. I never once raised my voice through any of this. Not that night, not on that call, not in any of the meetings that followed. I had spent 2 years being told, in 100 small ways, that my presence was tolerated rather than valued. And I found that the coldest, most complete response to that kind of disrespect was never volume. It was simply, finally, math. Tyler could not raise $61,000 in 90 days. He tried. He asked Bree's father for a loan, and I learned through the small-town grapevine that still connects everyone in this county, whether they like it or not, that Bree's father, a careful man who had built his own construction business from nothing, had quietly started asking his own questions about the payroll practices at the coffee shop his daughter was about to marry into. That conversation, from what I understand, did not go well for Tyler either. In the end, the buyout happened almost exactly as the paperwork predicted. Tyler couldn't produce the capital. The landlord, unwilling to carry the risk any longer, allowed the lease to transfer to me as the remaining guarantor of record. I did not reopen the shop under Tyler's name or brand. I sold the lease, the fixtures, and the goodwill to a young couple, 2 towns over, who had been looking for exactly that kind of space for their own roastery. People who thanked me with actual tears in their eyes because I gave them a fair price and even offered, unprompted, to introduce them to my old suppliers. The $61,000 came back to me in full, along with the remaining balance of the original $40,000 contribution my late wife's pension had funded. I put every dollar of it into a scholarship fund at the community college, in Richard's name, for kids studying trades, the kind of practical, unglamorous work that keeps a family fed even when nobody's writing podcasts about it. The wedding did not happen on the date Bree's parents had announced at that steakhouse. I heard, again through the grapevine, that it was postponed and then quietly, indefinitely shelved. I do not know the full story there, and I did not ask. Tyler has not spoken to me since. It has been 4 months now. Some nights that silence sits heavy in this house, heavier than I expected, because grief doesn't check whether the person you're grieving is actually gone or simply absent by choice. I still think about the boy at 19, standing in that hospital hallway with me, both of us wearing the particular blankness of people who have just been told the worst thing that will ever happen to them has already happened. I loved that boy with everything I had left after burying my son. I still do, somewhere underneath all of this. But I have learned, at 68 years old, something I wish someone had told me 40 years earlier. Loving someone with everything you have does not obligate them to treat you with anything at all. Sacrifice is not a contract. Just because you handed someone your whole retirement, your whole Sunday afternoons, your whole remaining strength, does not mean they owe you their respect in return, and waiting around for them to eventually understand that debt is its own quiet form of self-destruction. I gave Tyler a business. I gave him a roof over his head at 19 when the world had just taken both his parents. And in exchange, at an engagement dinner in front of 40 strangers, he told me my absence would be more convenient than my presence. People in this town look at me now, an old man who lives alone, who eats dinner most nights by himself at the same diner counter, and they assume there's something sad about that picture. They assume a man my age without his family close ought to be lonely, ought to be diminished by it, but I have never in my life felt more like myself than I do right now. I am not angry anymore. I spent the anger the week I sat with Carol going through that file, and what came after it was something quieter and, frankly, stronger. I do not check my phone anymore wondering if today is the day he softens. I do not drive 40 minutes for a business that was never really going to say my name out loud. I wake up, I have my coffee, brewed at home now, plain and unremarkable and entirely my own, and I go about a day that belongs to nobody but me. That is what nobody tells you about respect. It is not something you can earn by giving more. Sometimes the only way to be seen clearly by the people closest to you is to finally, fully, stop being available to be walked past. I did not do what I did out of hatred for my grandson. I did it because somewhere in that steakhouse, listening to him laugh at his own cruelty, I finally understood that the kindest thing I could do for both of us was to stop absorbing what he was so casually willing to throw away. Real love, the kind that actually holds a family together, was never supposed to mean disappearing quietly so someone else's life could look more convenient. If Tyler ever calls again ready to have an honest conversation, my door isn't locked. But I will never again mistake being tolerated for being loved, and neither should you, whatever your last name is, whatever the calendar says about how many years you've got left to finally believe it.